Hello and welcome to BCM 300 Game Experience Design. This week I am joined by game designer Richard Hall, and we are going to... Sorry, there you are. And this week we're talking about game mechanics. Hello, Richard.
Hi, how you doing?
I am well. I am enjoying this format. We had a really interesting chat in the previous lecture. It's, as you said, it's more of a podcast.
Effectively, we are at this point podcasting to our students, and they have to listen to us. How to get listeners?
So last week we talked about theme and setting, and when we were talking about whether it was history games, war games, colonial games, even party games, whenever we were talking about those games and their themes and their settings, we inevitably were talking about their mechanics as well. Next week, we'll come back and talk more about the relationship between theme and mechanics. But this week, I just want to make sure we introduce some kind of core, fundamental game mechanics to our students so that they start to develop their game design literacy. I'm sure many of these will be familiar to players, and in fact, many of these will be familiar to people who haven't even played board games. That they've played, whether it's or the perennial Monopoly,
The collection.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, let's get stuck into it then. I'm on the first slide, and I'm disagreeing with myself. Game mechanics.
Game studies.
Game mechanics aren't rules. Game mechanics are systems, but game mechanics are also the rules by which gameplay is enacted or generated. This is kind of preamble. This is a prezi that I put together for in-class discussion. So I might not actually read off these slides. I don't think that's going to be very productive.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea.
You guys, watching this can read the text on the screen, and you'll get, or you can go through the prezis in more detail, especially for reflecting on your own game design in your
like
blogs.
You already do all the time, obviously, because you're the best students.
Exactly. We presume that you'll spend that time going through the prezi. This slide is about the idea that games within a specific theme or within a specific setting can vary in the way they have vastly different mechanics. And we talked about this last week when we were talking about war games, is that the mechanics for Shogun are very different to the mechanics to Risk, even though their theme is war game. But their settings are kind of historical territory control.
And that's something you're going to find as you learn more and more about games in general, in that theme and mechanic are two kind of very independent things, and every different game can approach them differently. You're not locked into one thing or another. Indeed, you're going to find a lot of design comes from, hey, I really like this theme of this game, but I didn't want to play this game's implementation of it, so I made my own. That happens all the time.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely. I remember getting very frustrated with Monopoly when we were younger and creating new boards and new rules and basically a total overhaul mod for Monopoly so that it was almost kind of good. I do like to play.
A cool kid.
I played a lot of tabletop games. Funny that. Game mechanics provide ways for players to interact with each other and the game components. I think that's a fair enough statement.
Yeah.
All right. One of the most basic game mechanic is the idea of a turn. And this is where I was saying, we're going through some of the really simple ideas about games because you have to interrogate these core elements to make sure you understand them and to make sure you understand how they work. one of the primary characteristics of tabletop experiences is the idea of taking a turn, a segment of the game which has predefined actions. And so this is an interesting separation between mechanic and rules. The turn is the mechanic, and the majority of games that you'll play have turns, but then the individual rules for those turns or the individual rules for those mechanics will change infinitely.
Yeah. Everyone takes turns. Not everyone takes the same kind of turn.
Some games you can take a turn simultaneously. Card games, chess, tabletop games, even party games. These all require players to take turns. Sometimes you can take one action in a turn. Other times you can take a series of actions.
It's a whole, basically it's a space, but you do need, like, and the thing that feels really weird about this is explaining to you turns exist, and there's this moment of like, well, duh, but that's because these game mechanics are now so well worn that you don't interrogate them. So the first time you encounter a game with, for example, simultaneous turns, it might well blow your mind.
I'm sorry, I'm stuck up on that great comment that you just made, that a turn is a conceptual space. Yeah. That's lovely. I'm putting a pin in that. I'm running that up the flagpole to talk about in the discussions this week, because that's excellent.
See, students, here's a little bit of invisible ink for you. What Chris doesn't remember is he's the person who told me that years ago.
Yes, that is the magic of teaching. I'm basically offloading parts of my brain to you, which is fantastic. Okay, so the turn is fundamental, and within a turn, you can often take many actions. And so this is a kind of sub turn, a kind of space within a space, then, if you like. Actions are things that players can do in a turn. I love games that give me a small number of actions, but each one of those actions has real meaningful consequences.
You might sometimes hear this referred to as action economy.
This is why I like Terraforming Mars so much, because it can only do a couple of things, and it just has such pure action economy. Another game that is very dear to me called Clank. It's a dungeon diving game, and you can move, you can fight, and you can buy things, and that just creates a whole range of beautiful variation within the game.
I have a host of examples for this, but I don't want to drown you in them. Suffice to say, yeah,
I'm on the slide with examples. So give me a couple.
Okay, so one example would be Dominion. If you're at all remembering me mentioning the idea of a deck builder, Dominion is kind of the modern kickoff point for the deck builder, a game where you build your own little deck of cards during the play of the game. And Dominion, every game round of Dominion is you get to do all of your actions. You get to buy cards, then you get to clean up, and that's it. The cards in your hand tell you what you can do. You get to buy cards. That's a standard action, and then everything goes in the bin, and you draw a new hand of cards. And it's a very simple little set of actions, but in that play pattern. Like, I've taught you how to play Dominion. Like, just that basic a rundown of the rules will cover everything Dominion needs you to know.
I feel a little bit of shame whenever you mention Dominion, because you've talked a lot about it. It sounds like a fantastic game. I've seen it played. I've never played a game.
You don't have to play every game I mentioned.
No, but Dominion really stands out there as one that I should have played. Well, and it's kind of professional pride, playing all the games.
But also good news for students who want to check out this game I'm mentioning. Dominion is available to play online. It is completely like the whole game. You can just there's a website, and they'll do matchmaking for you and everything. It'll get you into the game, so you can check this thing out and see what it looks like compared to what you think I'm talking about.
Moving on then to another game mechanic that I'm particularly fond of, and I think you'll find that these slides are all mechanics that I like.
And that's by the way, that is both good to know, but also a good bias to recognize, students.
Yeah.
When game designers talk about mechanics, we often are going to be bringing our own biases. It's going to be stuff that we care about or have beef with.
Yeah, and I always say, just be upfront with your biases.
Yeah.
So in a game like chess, in a game like Snap, fish, even like just basic classic games, you tend to have two sides that are equal, that they can do the same things, and you just take turns between the two. Mm-hmm. One of the interesting things about niche games and contemporary games is the idea that players don't actually have to be totally the same. It's probably ideal that they be equal, but that equality can be very different. And this is known as the concept of asymmetry.
Yeah.
So a lot of the games that we talked about last week, their themes and their settings, players will take on different races, different classes, different historical factions, and good game design will make those choices distinct and asymmetrical, but not necessarily unbalanced, so that no one option is categorically better than the other. Sure, yeah. Players can learn how to play them better, but that comes down to the player rather than the actual system. So,
and that's when we start talking about things like mastery gaps and whatnot, and you can all like zone out on.
So games use asymmetry in indirect and direct ways. Indirectly, you can have things where the players are on a map and they're playing in different locations. So the starting conditions may vary. Another way of having asymmetry at the start of a game is to have players draw cards from a collective pool or their own deck or whatever, and they have the same number of cards, but those cards are totally different.
Similarly, there are games which take this and ramp this through the roof. If you want to look, again, just bringing up YouTube content that you can look into, Root is a game that recently came up, which just completely separate systems for each player.
I'm writing Root down because I'm a big fan of Root. I kickstarted that one.
Oh, Root's beautiful.
It's so beautiful. And Meeples Source have an upgrade pack of really cute Meeples that I really want. Anyway.
Sorry. Yes, I didn't just squeal at Meeples. That was from someone else on the call. I don't know who did that.
Direct asymmetry is when each player has a different role and can take different actions in a game. And this is where we talked a lot about last week. We talked about Scotland Yard.
Yeah.
But also Battlestar Galactica, where one person is the fugitive. Was Camelot, Shadows Over Camelot also?
Shadows Over Camelot is definitely in that category as well.
So this is where in Scotland Yard, for example, one player is the fugitive, and they're playing against the other players in the game, 2, 3, 4 players, and they have different abilities, different choices, and different ways of playing the game than the others. This creates a real interesting dynamic in the play experience, and it's nice if you're playing if it's a fast game and you're playing a couple of games, then you can rotate through the different roles. I've got a slide on Netrunner. A big fan of Netrunner. It's a card game, and it's a cyberpunk themed game. So one person is playing the hacker, and the other person is playing the corporation. And the two decks, so it's a card game. So the hacker has an entirely different deck. None of the cards in the hacker deck, or the runner deck as it's called, are like the cards in the corporation's deck. They are two totally different systems that are then pitted against one another.
And further, just because this is such a smart mechanic, the win conditions for the game are in the corporation's deck.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So if you want to win, you've got to get into that. You've got to get them out of that deck somehow.
It forces those two systems into that entanglement, into that conflict in really effective ways. And of course, it was originally a Richard Garfield game.
Yep.
So Richard Garfield, we will come back to when we talk about game designers.
Yep. Oops, you did it again.
So the next slide on auctions and bidding actually reveals that I was kind of balanced, because this is a mechanic I do not enjoy. An auction or a bidding system are common ways to force players to compete with each other, usually through resources, where you are gambling or you're pitting your resources that you've collected against the other players' resources and their collections. And you're gambling on the fact that you're paying or investing in an option, and with the hopes of that paying off in the long run. Camel Cup is a good example of this. What's some other bidding games?
So forgive the incredibly basic sounding suggestion, but there's a game called Going, Gone.
Yeah.
Which is at its root a bidding game where you are all trying to bid for the remains of a fancy estate. There's a couple of different games in that general genre, but unbelievably, and you're not going to... Rainer Knizia again made a Beowulf card game.
Beowulf?
Beowulf, yeah.
Wow.
And like, if I told you, it's a Beowulf card game, you might go, ooh, that sounds exciting. And then I say, hang on, don't get too excited, because it's a bidding auction game about being the successor to Beowulf after he dies. And it's just basically everyone sits around and says, well, if I get to be the next leader of the group, I'm going to institute these changes, and this is how everything's going to be. And it's a bidding game. It's just the weirdest connection for me of like, well, what's one of the most exciting German myths? All right, yeah, cool. Now, how do we make it really boring?
I also want to point out here that some people will love this game. And
it's really well rated on Board Game Geek.
When I say, I'm not a fan of auction bidding games, if your game design is about auctioning and bidding and this kind of mechanic, I'm not going to mark you down for that.
Yeah, we're not those people.
Not at all. If your auction bidding mechanic resonates really well with your playtesters and you get great feedback about it, and you have evidence that it's working, I'm not going to be arguing against that. I did have a slide here on Five Tribes. I'm a big fan of Five Tribes, but the very first thing in the game is you have to bid to be first, and I refuse to play this rule. Absolutely refuse to play this rule. We randomize it every time.
It's fantastically unnecessary too.
Same for Power Grid. You start with no power plants and you have to bid to be able to produce the power plant. We randomize this because I cannot handle it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on that one. It's one of those mechanics that has a great appeal to a particular type of designer, and they're not us. And yeah, it's a weird one.
So that brings us to a very broad mechanic, and I'm not sure even if it is a mechanic as such. And that is the notion of cards. And some games have a single deck of cards, and that's just it for the game. And you can have...
my games are just a deck of cards.
I was going to say, Richard has how many games now?
30-ish.
30-ish games using decks of cards. And I don't think you've even kind of scratched the surface, really, on the sheer potential of really, really different game experiences that you can have simply with a deck of cards. I mean, let's talk about some of your games. So there's Pie Face.
Sorry. I think you mean Pie Crimes.
Pie Crime. Sorry, what's
Pie Face is the one you find in the reject shop.
Oh, sorry. Pie Crimes.
No, so Pie
the,
Crimes is a Prisoner's Dilemma style game where
yes,
your hand is in total 2 cards. It's a question of, do you go along with the crime, or do you stand firm and behave appropriately as a baker in this situation should.
Yeah, sorry, I can't believe I got that mixed up. What's the bird game? Their names.
Murder Most Foul.
Oh my gosh, how can I not have remembered a pun so brilliant?
Yeah, so that's a path building card game where players are playing bird watchers wandering around a British common trying to get the best bird watching collection book. And like I've got card games about drunken Roman nobles striving to impress one another whilst the country they're in is burning to the ground. We have card games about cyberpunk crimes. We have card games about so many different things, and mechanically there is set collection, there is randomization, there is stacking. You can do stacking, slugs and loads. There's so many different things, and I can go really in deep and nerdy on card games if you want, but that would be 4 hours, and we need to just keep going.
What I'll do is I'll make a note to come back to this in the discussions this week, and
yes.
I'll try and make sure we have images of your games, because I think this is a perfect week to talk about your games, because you are an expert in this area.
Oh, thank you.
I'm gonna start recording. Hello. Yep. Okay. Just checking my mic.
Hello.
Okay. I accidentally pressed a setting before and it's my mic. But we'll figure that out. All right. Okay. So just kind of things to remember with cards is that sometimes things that players can do with cards can make the game experience a little bit. I hate the word problematic, but less than optimal. Mm-hmm. If you don't shuffle them sufficiently, for example.
Yeah, they're a pragmatic entity. You actually do interact with them as an object that exists, and that can be difficult.
I really like the way Pandemic uses cards to determine the difficulty of the game. And by simply taking out 1 or 2 specific cards from the deck that you experience, the game becomes easier. And simultaneously, if you add more of this one type of card, the game becomes harder. The elegance in that design is magnificent. Also, if you heard me use the phrase slugs and loads, Pandemic uses those. So what's a slug? Actually, I'll make a note: slugs and loads, and we'll come back and talk about that. Discussion. All right.
I've done a lot of phone interviews. I can't remember what I've already said.
It's fine. Cards can add mechanics. So when you're going through a deck, a card can add to the situation. A card can take away mechanics. Cards in hands can be used to interrupt other players. Now, this is a nice element because in a Euro game, it's very much, okay, this is my turn, I'm doing my thing, and then in your turn, you do your thing. Whereas when you're playing with cards, games like Exploding Kittens, Unstable Unicorns, Magic the Gathering, even Pokemon, right? Pokemon?
Yep. No, this creates what we call counterplay. Yeah. Where what you may believe to be your plan for your turn can't be guaranteed. And counterplay is really important to making games feel more interactive and alive, and it's a great way of making sure that players pay attention to each other's turns. Because one of the worst things you can have is a game situation where everyone is sitting on their own, playing their own private game, and don't care about the other players at the table. You want to avoid that. Cards are also a useful way of adding content to games. So there's games like Arkham Horror and Marvel Champions. Legendary, I think. The Legendary was the previous one. Okay. So I don't know.
So in those games, you have your character and you have your deck of cards that your character has to do things. But then there's the central story deck of cards, and then you're revealing events. And to up your game, you just buy a new character or you buy a new villain, put it into your game, and then it becomes episodic content, which is so much fun. All right.
Literally, this is an example of what they used to call a booster pack. Like, it is actually just there to be here is your game and more of it.
Yeah, I mean, a booster in collectible card games like Pokemon and Magic the Gathering is a random assortment of cards where you're getting a certain distribution of rare, uncommon, and common cards. Whereas in games like Netrunner, Marvel Champions, Arkham Horror, there are a specific set of cards, and you only need to buy the one pack, and it is literally like a new episode of the story, and I really enjoy that.
By the way, as far as we say about games, cards can add things to games. In a real sense, cards are one of the easiest ways to mod existing games.
Yeah,
I keep I tell students this every time. You could mod Monopoly with cards.
You could just your game design could be a Monopoly mod based with cards.
Yeah, like if you take Monopoly, like the core problem of Monopoly is it's roll and move. All right, cool. Replace the dice with cards. What does that look like? What have you learned from doing that? That strategy is a really interesting project.
I'd even play it just to see if you can make Monopoly fun, right?
Yeah. Help Chris heal.
So a mechanic that I do quite like is the capture mechanic. And this is, because I'm quite fond of tabletop war games, quite fond of very strategy games, particularly fantasy themed ones. And this is where
dorks is what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where you have like a map or a board, and you are trying to procedurally accumulate territory. And usually the person with the most territory wins. But sometimes in like games like Terraforming Mars, you have to have the most optimally organized territory. So it's not just
Warhammer has a similar thing where, control of a number of spaces is key to winning, but there are other factors involved.
Well said, yeah. So capture mechanics are fun. Chess is a very simple type of capture mechanic. Go is a much more complex, even though it's just black and white pieces on a black and white board, dots. You're trying to surround your opponent, so the territory that you're capturing is constantly evolving. I will have to show images of Von, because Von is one of my favorite abstract games where the area that you're trying to capture disappears as you play and the board shrinks rather than expands. That's a lot of fun. All right, that brings me to dice and dice mechanics. And I have to admit, I'm a bit of a dice nut. I like dice. I have a lot of dice. I enjoy rolling dice. I like roll for the galaxy because you're just rolling a silly amount of dice.
Warhammer appeals to that same primal part of the brain. Give me a mistful of dice.
One of my Warhammer armies, my Warhammer Age of Sigmar fantasy armies, I roll something like 60 or 80 dice at once.
Good God.
It's just silly, and it is so much fun.
What one man can handle such power?
Dice are material objects. Dice are not random, but they help us randomize results. Dungeons and Dragons, of course, is synonymous with different types of dice. So D4s, D8s, D10s. Actually, we should look at this week in discussion. Different types of dice. D10s can be used as percentile dices. D12s, and of course the eponymous D20.
Yep. The Stranger Things dices, kids.
Say again.
The Stranger Things dices,
The Oh, right. Sorry, Stranger Things. Yes,
the dice you see the kids using in Stranger Things. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. There's actually a Stranger Things D&D
box set. Yeah, looks really good. It's really nice production values. It looks like the old red box.
Dice can be used in so many different ways. You can use dice to simulate combat. You can use dice to determine resources. You can use dice to determine movement. You can use dice to determine the amount of research that your scientific character generates in one turn.
A good way to think of dice in this context is that a dice, like I sometimes say that cards are dice with memory, and therefore when people ask about dice, I can say, well, dice are cards that can forget. But typically speaking, dice are really good at things that are kind of non-discrete. So if you want to make a mechanic for, say, scientific research, like how much progress do you get done on scientific research, that really is something where you might get a little done, you might get a lot done, and you don't have a lot of control over how much or how little of it gets done. That's a really good place for dice to show up. And at the same time, though, you wouldn't necessarily use dice to represent a person unless you could have some way to refine the control over that dice. So think about dice as kind of like much more freewheeling and reckless than you would normally think with cards.
And this is why we don't see dice in Euro-style games, but we do in American. There's a kind of philosophy at work in dice that is a bit like, you know, casting your lot into the universe and seeing what happens.
Yeah. There's a conception of dice as being random or luck-based, and therefore you can win or lose on the roll of a dice. But there are so many different ways to play with dice that the idea that that simple is a little... it's a little myopic. I don't want to say, I don't want to say, oh, silly Germans, but
we'll come back and talk about dice again when we come back to materiality. But I was watching a game on YouTube the other day. It was a game of Warhammer, and it was a couple playing, and she had a really bad dice roll. And it was the second time in a row that these dice had rolled really badly. So she picked them up, and then she got out this little wooden dice jail and put the dice in the dice jail and put it on the shelf. And
I've seen dice drowning. I've seen dice torture. I've seen
dice freezing.
Yeah, I've seen dice being used. And this is really interesting because this is silly, but this is also ritualistic.
Super ritualistic.
That helps us connect to what we're doing, and like the silly things about what we're doing become more interesting.
The actual sociological term would be totemistic, that the dice become totems and represent the player, the person, in fact, and trying to mitigate the things that happen to them. All right, we're getting bogged down. Let's move on. Drafting. Okay. Singly, my most favorite mechanic.
Yeah, this one's a big one.
I absolutely like drafting. So drafting can happen with dice. It can happen with cards. It can happen with resources. It can happen in a lot of ways. Drafting forces the player to make a selection from a limited set of resources, and then the next player does the same until all the resources are gone. So there's a version of Magic the Gathering where you open a pack of cards, you take one of the cards out, and you pass it on to the next person. And I think it's 8 players.
Typically 8. There's a whole different way. There's a lot of ways to do this.
And then you assemble your deck based on those choices, and then you play games until you figure out who won. And that's a draft. It happens in Pokemon as well. There are a range of games that have this built into it. Clank has a kind of draft game where you are trying to collect gold and points, and those points are used to buy cards from a set that you then put into your deck. So it's drafting, but a little bit less random because you're making decisions from available selection. Potion Explosion is I'll have to show an example of this on the weekend. You put marbles into a little box, and then the marbles get all mixed up, and then you grab the marbles to make a potion. So you're drafting from the available set of resources. Actually, Potion Explosion's in my top 10
Yeah, it's one of those examples of like kids' games don't have to be bad games.
And Sagrada is similar. Sagrada, you roll a bunch of dice, but the dice are very pretty, clear plastic, and you assemble a stained glass window based on dice that you draw. Absolutely beautifully aesthetic game. All right, we're getting through these. I'm going to have some
about.
Go on.
We talked to an extent about drafting. Drafting can be drafting is one of those mechanics which is like so fluidly effective at what it's doing. Like it becomes a means to an end. Like drafting in Clank is used to represent stealth. In Magic the Gathering, it's meant to represent building a spell book in a hurry. Uh, um, in like the real world, drafting is used to build football teams. Quacks of Quedling Bird uses and Potion Explosion both use drafting to represent the unreliability of alchemy. Drafting is incredibly flexible. I have a drafting card game I made to try and solve a problem I have with drafting, which is you need a certain volume of players. And that game is about sorting books in a library. There are so many different things you can use drafting for. Seven Wonders, which we talked about earlier. Seven Wonders is a drafting game.
What's the trading game that you have with ships?
Oh yes, that would be Freight Expectations.
Freight Expectations.
Yeah, Freight Expectations, which is based in Wollongong. You can look on the side of the box and see the lighthouse.
Yeah, that's one of yours that I really like. I've played a few games of that, and it's a lot of fun. All right, let's move on then to movement. Movement is a very common tabletop game mechanic, and it often involves dividing a board into territory, sometimes into spaces where you have squares or hexes or regions. Sometimes, particularly in tabletop war games, you use rulers, so it's not always as easy as kind of unit movement. You've got to measure your troop to where it's going.
Yeah, this is an example of bounded versus unbounded space. The troop movements are on a grid. That is saying that the space is bounded and defined just for speed of movement. In the case of games like Warhammer, in order to make it feel more like real unbound movement, you have your measurement sticks and you actually have to be good at judging distance to play Warhammer. Well, not good, but it's a thing you need to do.
Not every game has to have movement, but I find it an enjoyable mechanic. I do tend to look for games that have some kind of movement. Or they're not, Terraforming Mars doesn't have movement. Potion Explosion doesn't. But I am a war game fan. So Oh, X-Wing.
Yeah, X-Wing is absolutely
X-Wing it uses Star Wars spaceships to basically dogfight between each other, and on the X-Wing has a dial, and you choose the movement that you're going to make, and it's a bank movement or a straight ahead movement. If I can, actually, I'm going to make a note to have a look at that. See if I can find a clip of X-Wing.
When it comes to movement in The Art of Failure, Jesper Juhl, with assistance from Chris Crawford, talks about how essentially a lot of movement cooks down to being chases or races.
I'm just writing that down. Yeah, absolutely. I'm trying to think if are there any cases that don't fit into that.
Well, there are plenty of places. There are plenty of cases that don't. It's just a lot of them do cook down to chase or race.
All right. So, all right, that brings us to the end of our kind of primer on game mechanics. this was a very, very small sample of the types of mechanics that you can have in your game design. And there are many instances of board games, tabletop game experiences that became popular and bestsellers because they found a subtle way to create a new mechanic out of an old mechanic, or created an entirely new mechanic. I think,
like I said, Dominion.
Yeah,
I keep bringing this up. Dominion is a fairly recent game, and it basically established the new idea of the deck builder.
Look at how successful, the deck builder, right, as a mechanic. Absolutely, well said. And I was going to make a similar example with Uno, right? Uno is a set collecting game that has a couple of very clever mechanics in the reverse, the draw four.
Uno's a juggernaut.
And
we could do a paper on Uno.
So when I'm, with the games that you're designing for this course, I recommend simplicity all the time, and simple game mechanics that are effective and fun are worth an enormous amount of money in this industry. Yeah. And so if you are going through your playtesting and you are encountering times where players are bogged down, or the speed is dragging of the game, the pace is dragging, or something's not quite working, the best thing to do is to experiment with different mechanics in order to achieve the experience that you want your players to have. And I think your games, Richard, are an excellent example of that, and we should talk about them this week in the discussion. So
there's a term I learned it out of all things from my dad's love of fast cars, which is referring to a particular type of Lotus, where they said, well, look, they can't actually get the car to be much faster with the engine they've got. So what do? And the phrase they used was they added lightness. Which is a fancy way of saying they found every single thing they could do to take away. And really good design is a matter of finding every single thing you can take away.
And it's not always a case where the mechanic is working. You might have a really great mechanic, and it's really cool and it's fun, but it's not quite working in the game that you have. And you can take that out, you can set that aside, and you can make an entirely new game around that mechanic.
Yeah, bank it. They don't go off.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no intellectual property for mechanics. So if you're playing a game and it has a mechanic that you really like, you can take that mechanic and you can change it and you can mold it and you can fit it into your game. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And some of the best games do that. The card drawing mechanics of Splendor, for example, are in a new Kickstarter game that I backed called In the Hall of the Mountain King. And I love that it's there, and it just makes both the experience of both of those games so much more. All right. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me along. This was heaps of fun. This is the subject. This is the kind of stuff I will just talk about forever if you let me.
Me too. So I have to stop us. We'll catch up next week or next time, and we'll be talking about the synthesis of mechanics and themes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about things being half real.
All right. Thanks, mate.